On the 2nd February 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad officially ended with the surrender of the remnants of the 6th Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army in Stalingrad. In this video we'll look at the various German generals that were involved in the battle and what they wrote in their memoirs or studies about the encirclement and fate of the soldiers involved. Now, since some people treat memoirs quite often as historical fact, or at least not critically enough, be aware that memoirs are usually a source that should be taken with a lot of salt for various reasons, even if the author had no bad intentions. Generally, memoirs often serve a particular purpose or better purposes. Some of them might be even unconscious. They can be entirely self-serving, yet even in that case they have a particular audience, and that audience lives in a certain time. What do I mean by that? Well, if a memoir is about furthering one's career, for instance, many former Wehrmacht generals wanted two things: first, not to be convicted in the trials after the war, and second, ideally also continue to serve in the armed forces. The focus shifted over time since the Cold War changed the priorities of the Western Allies, and as such the treatment of Germany and its former soldiers. This is pointed out well by Manfred Kehrig. Those of the generals who still published their memoirs at the end of the 1940s had been involved in the resistance against Hitler in this or that form. The broad production of memoirs, which began in the early 1950s, was then already dominated by the Cold War and the discussion about the West German rearmament, and was aimed not only at justifying and rehabilitating the German officer, but also at highlighting the continuum of German military history with regard to the Bundeswehr. Let us start with Wilhelm Keitel. He was the chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, the OKW. Keitel was executed in 1946 after the Nuremberg trials. Yet during his time in prison, he wrote down his memoirs that were published in 1961. In these he notes that the looming encirclement of the 6th Army at the end of November 1942 had only allowed for one decision: to cease the attack in the city and to withdraw the entire army to the west. That such a decision would have strategic consequences, namely the withdrawal of Army Group A from the Caucasus and the abandonment of the Caucasian oil, he admittedly leaves unmentioned. It should also be noted there are sufficient reports from which it is clear that he made serious efforts to prevent that Hitler received a realistic presentation and reports about the situation of the 6th Army, and as such also had an influence on the resulting proposals for Hitler's decisions. Additionally, he also adds that Stalingrad is among his worst memories in regard to the fate of the soldiers. Now the next in line would be Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht. Yet he didn't leave behind any memoirs. Luckily, his deputy Walter Warlimont did. In his work, he looked at the various structures and the responsibilities. He looks at the influence of the operations staff on Hitler and the coordination of various other services. He concludes that the operations staff had little influence on Hitler in regard to Stalingrad, since this was mostly the area of the Army General Staff. It is important to point out here that although formally the operations staff of the Wehrmacht should have been in charge, since the Wehrmacht High Command was a joint command of the Army, Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine, in reality the Army High Command was mostly in charge of the Eastern Front, whereas the Wehrmacht High Command in charge of other theaters of war. Because of uncertainty and jealousy over the relative status of the Wehrmacht High Command and those three services in the theaters of war were placed under the command of either OKW or the OKH, the later the Army High Command. As such, Warlimont's conclusion is not particularly surprising. For Warlimont, Stalingrad was particularly suitable for demonstrating the amateurishly organized leadership relationship with the antagonism between the various command staffs and for exposing Hitler's character, who, when the 6th Army had to cease fighting at the end of January 1943, outdid himself in defamation of its leaders. Next in line is Franz Halder, who was the chief of the Army General Staff until the 25th September 1942, so about 2 months before the 6th Army was encircled, but still quite responsible for the planning of Case Blue. Now it is important to point out that Halder wrote a report for the Operational History German section for the US Historical Division in 1949, which is not necessarily a memoir per se, yet considering the conclusions of the report it seems as self-serving as most memoirs. According to Kehrig, Halder completely ignores the strategic situation, namely what consequences the retreat of the 6th Army would have had on Army Group A, which was located in the Caucasus, nor the logistical situation. Kehrig concludes, In his writing, Halder's crucial concern is to portray Hitler as the dictator solely responsible for the Stalingrad catastrophe. To strongly relativize the joint responsibility of the commanders at the front as well as the chief of the army's general staff, and to portray Hitler as a commander who was simply not interested in the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. For more information about Halder, be sure to check out my interview with Dr. Roman Töppel about generals blaming Hitler. The next one is Zeitzler, who was Halder's successor as chief of the German army's general staff, and as such had a lot of responsibility, and he was Hitler's highest ranking military advisor. As such, Zeitzler wrote various studies on Stalingrad, but none of which had been published in German. Although similar to Halder, those are not necessarily memoirs in the strict sense. He paints a rather vivid picture about his role in trying to influence Hitler. Zeitzler gives a highly dramatic description of these continuous arguments, always trouble, always noise, the correctness of which cannot be confirmed in detail from the files nor by his closest subordinates after the war, since they usually did not attend the situation lectures. It is hard to determine how correct these statements are, although his chief of operations staff Hrsg confirmed in his memoirs, then again, those are memoirs. Although what I think is more convincing aspect is that Zeitzler limited his own rations to the amount that was given to the soldiers in Stalingrad. The only problem is that the source for this seems to be Warlimont's memoirs. So as always, it's hard to know. Hrsg notes, in Zeitzler's notes, knowledge of human fate of these encircled in Stalingrad is convincingly evident. Not only did he impose on himself and the officers of the German general staff of the army the same rations for days on end as those ordered for the troops in Stalingrad, but he also spoke about his experience of the effects of the hunger to Hitler. Next is Maximillian von Weichs. He was the commander of Army Group B. As such, he was the superior of Paulus, the commander of the 6th Army. Additionally and more importantly, Weichs was responsible for the 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army attacking Stalingrad, not properly securing their flanks and missing the upcoming Soviet counterattack. The encirclement of the 6th Army at Stalingrad prompted Weichs, after consultation with the commander of Luftflotte 4, to propose to Hitler the abandonment of Stalingrad, the breakout of the 6th Army and the formation of a new front. But Hitler refused and left Weichs only in charge of the 8th Italian, 2nd Hungarian and 2nd German Army, while he renamed the command staff of the 11th Army to Supreme Command of the Army Group Dawn and charged Field Marshal von Manstein with the formation of a new defensive front southwest of Stalingrad and the liberation of the 6th Army. Since the encirclement of Stalingrad was complete on the 23rd November, already on the 26th of November Manstein was basically in charge. Weichs' memoirs were not finished. He started a manuscript but died. As such, only this manuscript could be used. His memoirs served the purpose of clarifying the responsibility until the takeover of the command by Army Group Dawn under Field Marshal von Manstein. It becomes clear that von Weichs not only demanded from the Army High Command on the 23rd November 1942 that the 6th Army retreat to the west, but was also determined independently order the 6th Army to retreat to the west on the 24th November 1942, since without clear instructions from the Army High Command, the 6th Army was to retreat to west on its own. Yet the last order did not happen, since an order from the Army High Command finally arrived. Speaking of Manstein, let's look at his statements. General von Manstein was seen as one of the most able commanders of Germany in the Second World War, both inside the Wehrmacht during the war and after the war by most scholars as well. As mentioned before, Hitler put Manstein in charge and transformed his 11th Army into Army Group Dawn, which was put in charge of the encirclement on the 26th of November. The most important aspect with Manstein is that he was the exception among German generals regarding if a breakout should be conducted or not. Manstein broke up what had been an anonymous assessment of the perils of the 6th Army situation by Weichs, the commander of the army group, Paulus and many other German generals, and did not explicitly favor an immediate breakout from the pocket. The semi-official German history of the Second World War judges Manstein harshly for his decision. It was neither the operational situation of the 6th Army nor the question of the time required for its relief which assessed Manstein fundamentally differently than Weichs, the commander of Army Group B, and the other generals. What distinguished him from them was, in the first place, his greater confidence in the supply and staying power of the encircled army. How true this confidence was must be left undecided. Well founded, it was certainly not. Of course, lately there's some serious debate if at Stalingrad and a breakout order was even an option at all, because it could likely have followed to the breakdown of the whole front and especially to the loss of Army Group A. Now, about Manstein's memoirs, those have the title Lost Victories and thus hint strongly at the general direction. Lost Victories contains a complete chapter on Stalingrad, which is also considered one of the most important ones in the book. He introduces this with a longer reflection on the sacrifice of the German army that perished there, which can only be compared to the Spartan struggle against the Asian masses of the Persian despot Xerxes. Which sounds like it was propaganda written during the war, not after the war. He expands on the virtues of the German soldier. The invocation of these soldierly virtues against the background of the nationalist socialist objectives, which in 1954 became much more clearly visible than in 1942-1943, prompts Manstein to state that loyalty, bravery and performance of duty, despite all abuse by Hitler, are a song of songs of German soldiers, because of the bona fides, the good faith demonstrated by soldiers. After these statements, Manstein tries to show two different aspects, namely to justify that his decisions were the best suited for the military situation at hand, considering the limitations given by Hitler, and second, to portray the leadership of the Sixth Army to act without authority that was too optimistic and did not understand his operational idea. Manstein persistently points out again and again that he made it clear to Hitler and the command of the Sixth Army that the withdrawal of the encircled units was the last unavoidable necessity from the beginning. As far as Hitler is concerned, this is also true, but toward General Paulus and his staff, Manstein failed to make it that clear. At any rate, the records show this beyond any doubt. Finally, General Friedrich Paulus, the commander of Sixth Army, who was encircled in Stalingrad as well, and as such was captured by the Soviets. Hitler promoted him to General Field Marshal while encircled and basically indirectly ordering him to commit suicide, since it was noted by Hitler that no German field general was ever captured so far. In captivity, Paulus joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, which was a German anti-Nazi organization in the Soviet Union. As such, he was seen as a traitor. Furthermore, he was one of the key witnesses of the Nuremberg trial against the German generals. Later, a trial against Paulus in the Soviet Union should have been initiated in 1949, yet Stalin himself intervened that it did not happen. Needless to say, he later settled in East Germany, which was also a dictatorship and under Soviet occupation. As such, his memoirs have a very different context to those of the other generals mentioned here. Well, so much for the orientation. Paulus outlines in his memoirs why he repeatedly followed Hitler's orders. He justified his adherence to Hitler's directive to hold on November 24, 1942 by stating that unauthorized action would only have led to the disorganization and collapse of the entire southern part of the Eastern Front. These were his initial reasons. Later on, after the failure of the attempt to deploy the troops in December 1942, however, the primary goal was to gain time for the reconstruction of the Southern Front and rescue of the armies in the Caucasus by holding out in the encirclement. As pointed out by Gerd, Paulus was involved in the planning of the operations earlier. As such, he was aware of the importance of covering the flanks of the operations in the Caucasus. The subjectively recognized hopelessness of a military situation does not justify for him the right to refuse to obey orders. Paulus acknowledged without reservations his responsibility as army commander and thus the destruction of an entire army. To summarize, the various memoirs include a wide variety and range of aspects. Some are mere justifications, whereas others are basically blaming others. Some contain reflections about the German officer corps, others deal with the military situation, logistics, various responsibilities and the command structure. Nevertheless, the elementary mission of the military leader breaks out through again and again. Responsibility over death and life, and the care for the soldiers entrusted to him. So it is not surprising that many generals dedicate their memoirs to the memory of the fallen soldiers of all ranks. I hope you learned something new here. If you like what I do, consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar. Big thank you to all of you who already supported me. And as always, sources are listed in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.